The story behind The Scorpion King begins several years before the film itself entered production. Unlike many fantasy adventures that begin as original standalone ideas or direct adaptations of novels, The Scorpion King was born from an unexpected opportunity created by another successful franchise. Its existence can be traced back to the growing popularity of the Mummy series at the end of the 1990s, when audiences demonstrated a renewed enthusiasm for large-scale adventure films filled with ancient civilizations, supernatural mythology, action, and spectacle. When The Mummy premiered in 1999, it became one of the surprise commercial successes of the year. The film combined horror, adventure, comedy, and romance into an energetic blockbuster that appealed to a broad audience. Universal Pictures quickly realized they possessed a valuable franchise. Rather than treating the film as a one-time success, the studio began looking for ways to expand the fictional universe. Sequels, spin-offs, and additional stories suddenly became realistic possibilities. During the development of The Mummy Returns, the filmmakers searched for new characters that could leave a lasting impression. One of these was an ancient warrior known as the Scorpion King. In the mythology created for the sequel, the Scorpion King was once a great human leader who made a terrible bargain with supernatural forces. After facing defeat in battle, he called upon the god Anubis for victory. In exchange, he surrendered his soul and became a cursed servant whose army conquered countless lands before eventually disappearing into legend. Although the character appears only briefly in the narrative of The Mummy Returns, the filmmakers believed he carried enormous storytelling potential. Audiences were introduced to him as an almost mythical figure whose history stretched thousands of years into the past. Rather than seeing his entire life, viewers encountered only the final stage of his existence after centuries of corruption and transformation. The character also attracted attention because he was portrayed by professional wrestler Dwayne Johnson, who is still widely known around the world by his wrestling name, The Rock. At the time, Johnson was one of the biggest stars in sports entertainment. His charisma, physical presence, and natural confidence immediately stood out despite having very limited acting experience. The casting itself represented an interesting gamble. Hollywood had attempted to transform wrestlers into movie stars before, but the results were mixed. While performers such as Hulk Hogan had achieved some recognition in film, few had become genuine leading men capable of carrying major studio productions. Universal recognized something different in Johnson. He possessed not only an imposing physique, but also remarkable screen presence. Even during his relatively short appearance in The Mummy Returns, executives noticed audiences responding positively whenever he appeared on screen. After internal discussions, the studio began considering whether The Scorpion King could support an entire feature film. Instead of producing another direct sequel immediately, executives explored the possibility of telling the warrior's origin story. This approach offered several advantages. First, it allowed the studio to expand the Mummy universe without relying entirely on the existing main characters. Second, it created an opportunity to launch a new action hero who might carry multiple films of his own. Finally, it provided Johnson with an ideal transition from professional wrestling into mainstream cinema. This decision also reflected a larger trend that was becoming increasingly common in Hollywood during the early 2000s. Studios were beginning to understand the long-term value of interconnected franchises. Although modern cinematic universes had not yet become the dominant business model they are today, companies already recognized that successful fictional worlds could generate multiple stories centered on different characters. The Scorpion King became one of the earlier examples of this strategy. Once the project received preliminary approval, writers faced an immediate creative challenge. The version of the Scorpion King introduced in The Mummy Returns had been depicted primarily as a legendary conqueror who eventually transformed into a monstrous guardian. Very little was known about his earlier life. This lack of detailed backstory actually became an advantage because it provided enormous creative freedom. Instead of feeling constrained by existing continuity, the writers could imagine almost any journey that eventually led toward the legend described in the sequel. They were essentially creating the character from the ground up. Rather than presenting him as an already established king, they chose to portray him as Mathayus, a skilled assassin belonging to a small group known as the Akkadian warriors. This decision fundamentally changed the audience's relationship with the character. Rather than beginning with an all-powerful ruler, viewers would follow an underdog force to survive through intelligence, courage, and determination. The transformation from wandering mercenary to legendary leader offered a much stronger dramatic arc than simply depicting an already successful conqueror. Early screenplay development emphasized several goals simultaneously. The film needed enough connections to the Mummy franchise to satisfy existing fans while remaining accessible to audiences who had never seen the earlier movies. If the screenplay relied too heavily upon established mythology, newcomers might feel excluded. If it ignored the connection entirely, existing fans might wonder why the film carried the Scorpion King title. Every film reflects the priorities of the people guiding its creative direction. In the case of The Scorpion King, director Chuck Russell approached the project with a very specific goal. Rather than trying to imitate the exact style of the Mummy films, he wanted to create an adventure that stood on its own while still feeling like it belonged within the same larger universe. His vision centered on making an energetic, character-driven fantasy that emphasized practical action, charismatic performances, and old-fashioned adventure over excessive visual effects or overly complicated mythology. To understand why the film feels the way it does, it is important to first understand Chuck Russell's background as a filmmaker. Before directing The Scorpion King, Russell had already built a reputation for making entertaining genre films that balance spectacle with accessibility. Throughout his career, he demonstrated an ability to take stories rooted in fantasy, horror, or comic book worlds and present them in a way that felt approachable for mainstream audiences. His earlier work included films that mixed action with humor, supernatural elements with emotional storytelling, and larger-than-life characters with relatable motivations. Rather than making films that were deliberately dark or artistically abstract, Russell generally favored clear storytelling, memorable heroes, exciting pacing, and visual entertainment. Audiences could easily understand what the protagonists wanted, who the villains were, and what was at stake. This philosophy became one of the defining characteristics of The Scorpion King. Russell understood that the movie was never intended to be a historical drama or a deeply philosophical fantasy. Instead, he viewed it as a modern version of the classic adventure films that had entertained audiences for decades. His objective was to capture the excitement of legendary heroes battling tyrants in mysterious ancient lands while ensuring that the story remained fun and accessible. One of the most significant creative choices Russell made involved shifting the tone away from horror. Although the Mummy franchise contained supernatural monsters, curses, and moments of suspense, Russell believed The Scorpion King should primarily celebrate adventure. Danger certainly exists throughout the film, but the overall experience is driven by excitement rather than fear. This distinction influences nearly every scene. Action sequences are energetic instead of brutal. Comedic moments appear regularly to relieve tension. Even when characters face deadly situations, the movie rarely lingers on violence or despair. Russell wanted audiences to enjoy the journey rather than feel overwhelmed by darkness. Another major element of his vision involved the portrayal of the protagonist. Because the film represented Dwayne Johnson's first starring role in a major motion picture, Russell recognized that introducing a new action hero required careful balance. He could not simply present Mathayus as an invincible warrior who never struggled. Audiences generally connect more strongly with heroes who overcome adversity rather than those who effortlessly defeat every obstacle. Throughout the film, Mathayus experiences numerous setbacks. He loses allies, suffers injuries, makes mistakes, and frequently finds himself outnumbered. However, each challenge provides another opportunity for the audience to appreciate his determination and resilience. Russell deliberately emphasized these moments because they humanized the character. At the same time, Russell wanted Mathayus to possess undeniable charisma. This objective aligned perfectly with Dwayne Johnson's natural strengths. Long before entering Hollywood, Johnson had become famous for his confidence, humor, and ability to command attention in front of enormous live audiences. Russell wisely chose not to suppress those qualities. Instead, he incorporated them into the character. As a result, Mathayus differs from many traditional fantasy warriors. He smiles, teases his companions, responds with witty remarks, and projects confidence even during dangerous situations. These personality traits make him feel approachable despite his extraordinary combat abilities. Russell understood that audiences often remember characters because of their personalities rather than simply their victories. This emphasis on charm also separated the film from many fantasy epics released during the same era. While other heroes often appeared brooding, emotionally distant, or consumed by revenge, Mathayus frequently demonstrates optimism. He enjoys challenges, forms friendships, and develops genuine affection for those around him. Russell believed these qualities would make him a stronger long-term franchise protagonist. Another aspect of Russell's directing philosophy involved maintaining visual clarity during action scenes. Many action films rely on rapid editing, shaky camera movements, or confusing choreography that makes it difficult for audiences to understand what is happening. Russell preferred a more traditional style. During combat sequences, the camera usually allows viewers to observe complete movements rather than hiding choreography through constant cuts. Sword fights emphasize athletic performance instead of visual confusion. This approach reflects Russell's belief that action should showcase the physical abilities of performers whenever possible. Because Dwayne Johnson possessed an impressive athletic background, Russell frequently designed scenes that highlighted his size, agility, and physical presence. Instead of relying entirely upon stunt doubles or digital enhancements, many moments allowed Johnson himself to perform convincingly as the heroic warrior. This authenticity strengthens audience investment because viewers can clearly see the actor participating in the action. One of the defining characteristics of The Scorpion King is the way it constructs a fictional version of the ancient world that feels both familiar and mythical at the same time. Although the movie takes inspiration from real civilizations, historical cultures, and archaeological imagery, it never attempts to present an accurate recreation of history. Instead, it creates a legendary landscape where ancient kingdoms, supernatural prophecy, powerful warriors, and timeless myths exist together, as if they were part of one enormous epic tale. This approach gives the film a unique identity. Rather than asking audiences to learn complicated historical details, it invites them to step into a world that operates according to the logic of legend. The setting immediately establishes that viewers are entering an age long before recorded history, as most people understand it. The opening narration describes a period when tribes and kingdoms constantly struggled for survival, and when powerful rulers could shape the fate of entire regions through military conquest. This introduction serves an important storytelling purpose. Instead of explaining detailed political systems or historical timelines, it creates the impression that this is an era defined by survival, ambition, and destiny. Because of this approach, the audience accepts that many aspects of the world will be exaggerated. Cities appear larger than life. Armies seem capable of crossing vast deserts without difficulty. Rulers possess almost unlimited authority over their followers. Heroes perform extraordinary physical feats. None of these elements are presented as realistic history. They belong to the tradition of mythological storytelling, where symbolism often matters more than realism. The geography of the film plays a major role in shaping its atmosphere. Deserts dominate much of the landscape, creating an environment that is both beautiful and dangerous. Endless stretches of sand communicate isolation, forcing characters to rely on endurance and determination simply to survive. Unlike forests or cities that provide shelter and resources, the desert constantly reminds both the audience and the characters that nature itself can become an enemy. This harsh environment also reinforces one of the film's central themes. Only the strongest, smartest, and most adaptable individuals can survive. Mathayus is introduced as someone who understands how to navigate this unforgiving world. His survival skills are just as important as his fighting abilities. He knows how to move through hostile territory, conserve resources, avoid enemies, and use the landscape to his advantage. The setting, therefore, becomes an extension of his character rather than merely a backdrop for action scenes. The desert also creates striking visual contrast throughout the movie. Bright sunlight, golden sand, rocky cliffs, and distant mountains combine to produce images that feel both ancient and timeless. The openness of these landscapes emphasizes the loneliness of many characters. When a single rider crosses an enormous desert, the audience immediately understands how small one person can appear against the vastness of the world. At the same time, the desert serves another narrative purpose. It creates natural barriers between civilizations. Kingdoms are separated not only by political differences, but also by geography. Traveling from one location to another becomes an adventure in itself, allowing the story to unfold through a series of encounters rather than remaining confined to a single city. In contrast to the open wilderness, the cities within the film represent centers of power, wealth, and political control. Memnon's kingdom stands as the most important urban environment in the story. Its walls, towers, palaces, and military structures communicate stability and dominance. Unlike the unpredictable desert outside, the city appears organized and carefully controlled. However, this order comes at a cost. The city reflects Memnon's authoritarian rule. Guards patrol every entrance. Soldiers monitor public spaces. Ordinary people live under constant fear of punishment. Architecture, therefore, becomes a form of environmental storytelling. Large stone walls symbolize not only protection from outside enemies, but also imprisonment for those living within the kingdom. The palace itself functions as the physical representation of Memnon's authority. Elevated above the surrounding city, it reminds everyone that power belongs to a small ruling elite. Audiences instinctively understand this hierarchy simply by observing how the environment is designed. The higher characters stand within the palace, the greater their political influence appears to be. Another interesting aspect of the world building involves the way different tribes and cultures interact. The film does not portray humanity as one unified civilization. Instead, numerous independent groups exist, each with their own traditions, loyalties, and methods of survival. Some communities specialize in warfare, while others depend upon trade, farming, or alliances for protection. Mathayus himself belongs to the Acadians, a group respected for producing highly skilled assassins and mercenary warriors. Although relatively little time is spent explaining the full history of the Acadians, their reputation tells the audience everything necessary. They are feared because of their exceptional combat abilities, suggesting generations of military tradition. This approach demonstrates efficient world building. Rather than presenting lengthy historical lectures, the screenplay allows reputation to communicate cultural identity. Whenever characters react to Mathayus as an Acadian, viewers gain additional understanding of the society from which he comes. The film also establishes a world where prophecy influences politics. Cassandra's visions are not treated as vague superstitions, but as genuine supernatural abilities capable of shaping military strategy. Because Memnon believes completely in her predictions, he gains enormous confidence when making decisions. Rival tribes similarly believe that eliminating the sorceress will weaken his rule. This belief system fundamentally changes how power operates within the story. Intelligence gathered through scouts or spies becomes less valuable than supernatural foresight. Rulers compete not only for armies and territory, but also for access to mystical knowledge. This creates an interesting blend of political realism and fantasy. The Scorpion King is a film that blends several genres into a single adventure while remaining easy for audiences to follow. Although it was released as a spin-off connected to the Mummy franchise, it ultimately establishes its own identity by combining action, fantasy, adventure, historical fiction, and elements of mythology. Instead of belonging entirely to one category, the movie borrows familiar conventions from multiple genres, selecting the strengths of each to create an entertaining and accessible story. This mixture is one of the reasons the film appealed to a broad audience. Viewers could enjoy exciting combat, mythical storytelling, moments of humor, romance, political conflict, and supernatural mystery without feeling overwhelmed by any one aspect. At its core, The Scorpion King is first and foremost an action-adventure film. Nearly every major sequence revolves around physical movement, dangerous missions, survival, or combat. From the opening assassination attempt to the final confrontation with Memnon, the story constantly pushes its characters into situations requiring courage, quick thinking, and athletic skill. Unlike slower historical dramas that focus primarily on dialogue or politics, the film keeps the narrative moving through action. The adventure aspect is equally important. Rather than remaining in one location, the characters travel across deserts, villages, hidden camps, mountain passes, and fortified cities. Each new destination introduces fresh challenges, allies, and enemies. This sense of continuous movement is one of the defining characteristics of classic adventure cinema. The audience never feels confined because the story constantly expands its world through exploration. Adventure stories traditionally feature heroes leaving familiar surroundings to confront unknown dangers, and The Scorpion King follows this formula closely. Mathayus begins as a mercenary with a straightforward mission, but as events unfold, he finds himself involved in a much larger struggle that forces him to grow beyond his original role. Every new location represents another stage in his personal development. The action genre contributes the film's energy. Sword fights, ambushes, horseback chases, archery, hand-to-hand combat, and large-scale battles appear throughout the movie. However, the action rarely exists simply for spectacle. Most combat sequences also move the story forward by changing relationships, revealing character traits, or increasing the stakes. For example, when Mathayus survives overwhelming odds, audiences learn not only that he is a skilled warrior, but also that he possesses determination and creativity. He does not rely solely on physical strength. Instead, he frequently improvises solutions, uses the environment to his advantage, and adapts when circumstances change. This makes the action feel connected to character development rather than existing as isolated entertainment. Another major genre influencing the film is fantasy. Unlike historical epics grounded entirely in reality, The Scorpion King introduces supernatural elements that shape both the world and the narrative. Prophecy, visions of the future, divine influence, and legendary mythology all exist alongside otherwise realistic combat and politics. Interestingly, the fantasy remains relatively restrained. Audiences do not encounter countless magical creatures, elaborate spell-casting systems, or impossible worlds floating in the sky. Instead, fantasy operates quietly beneath the surface. Cassandra's visions guide military decisions. Legends about ancient powers influence human behavior. Destiny appears to shape events in ways that ordinary logic cannot fully explain. This restrained approach makes the supernatural feel more mysterious. Because magical events occur infrequently, they carry greater significance. Every prophecy feels important because it is unusual rather than commonplace. The fantasy, therefore, enhances the story without overwhelming it. Mythology also serves as one of the film's strongest genre foundations. Although the story creates its own fictional interpretation of ancient history, it borrows heavily from mythological traditions found throughout human civilization. Powerful kings, chosen heroes, sacred destinies, divine intervention, legendary battles, and larger-than-life warriors all belong to storytelling traditions that stretch back thousands of years. Mathayus himself resembles the archetypal hero found in countless myths. He begins as an outsider possessing extraordinary abilities but limited political power. Through courage, sacrifice, and perseverance, he gradually becomes a leader capable of challenging a seemingly invincible tyrant. This structure appears repeatedly in ancient myths from many different cultures. The film's treatment of destiny also reflects mythological storytelling. Characters repeatedly struggle with questions about whether the future can be changed. Cassandra's vision suggests that certain events are inevitable, while Mathayus believes that courage and determination allow individuals to shape their own fate. This conflict between prophecy and free will has appeared in myths since ancient times. Another important genre present throughout the movie is historical fiction. Although the film does not attempt historical accuracy, it uses recognizable elements from ancient civilizations to create a believable setting. Weapons, architecture, clothing, political systems, and military organizations all resemble aspects of real ancient societies. However, history functions primarily as inspiration rather than documentation. The filmmakers freely combine ideas from Egyptian, Mesopotamian, Persian, and other cultures without worrying about chronological accuracy. This creative freedom allows the story to prioritize entertainment over historical precision. This approach places the film within the tradition sometimes called sword and sandal cinema. These films generally depict ancient worlds filled with warriors, kings, gladiators, conquerors, and legendary heroes. They emphasize grand adventure, physical courage, and spectacular landscapes rather than strict historical realism. The Scorpion King shares many characteristics with classic sword and sandal productions released during the 1950s and 1960s. Muscular heroes confront tyrants. Kingdoms rise and fall through military conflict. Deserts and temples provide dramatic settings. Personal honor becomes more important than political compromise. Audiences familiar with older adventure cinema can easily recognize these influences. The opening sequence of The Scorpion King serves as the audience's introduction not only to the story, but also to the entire world in which the film takes place. Within approximately the first 10 to 15 minutes, the movie establishes its setting, introduces the central conflict, presents the main protagonist, explains the political situation, defines the tone, and creates expectations for the adventure that follows. This opening is carefully structured to provide just enough information for viewers to understand the stakes without overwhelming them with complicated exposition. Rather than relying on lengthy explanations, the film communicates much of its world through action, visual storytelling, and character interactions. The movie begins with narration that immediately places the audience in a legendary period far removed from modern history. Instead of introducing a specific historical date or referencing actual civilizations, the narration describes an age when ambitious rulers sought to conquer neighboring kingdoms and when survival depended upon strength, courage, and leadership. This opening establishes that viewers are entering a mythic version of the ancient world rather than a documentary recreation of history. This choice is important because it gives the filmmakers creative freedom. Audiences understand from the very beginning that supernatural elements, legendary heroes, and exaggerated events naturally belong within this universe. The narration prepares viewers to accept prophecy, impossible feats of combat, and mythical storytelling without questioning historical accuracy. Another important function of the opening narration is its efficiency. In only a short amount of time, the audience learns that a powerful warlord named Memnon is rapidly expanding his empire. Entire tribes have already fallen before his armies, while the remaining free peoples face almost certain destruction unless something changes. This information establishes the central external conflict immediately, rather than presenting Memnon simply as another ambitious king. The film explains that his greatest advantage comes from a mysterious sorceress capable of predicting the future. Because she can foresee enemy movements and battlefield decisions, Memnon consistently defeats every opponent before battles even begin. This supernatural advantage transforms an ordinary military campaign into something much more intimidating. The idea of prophecy immediately introduces one of the film's recurring themes. Throughout the story, characters struggle with questions about fate, destiny, and whether the future can truly be changed. By introducing this concept so early, the movie quietly establishes an important philosophical question beneath the action. After presenting the overall situation, the film shifts toward a council of tribal leaders who have gathered to discuss their desperate circumstances. This scene serves several narrative purposes simultaneously. First, it expands the audience's understanding of the political landscape. Viewers realize that numerous independent tribes exist rather than one unified kingdom. Second, the meeting demonstrates the level of fear spreading across the region. Experienced warriors and respected leaders openly admit that conventional warfare has failed. Every attempt to defeat Memnon has resulted in disaster because his sorceress always knows what will happen before battles begin. This atmosphere of desperation increases the dramatic stakes. Audiences understand that traditional solutions are no longer effective. Something unconventional will be required to stop the conquest. The discussion among the tribal leaders also introduces one of the first major strategic ideas in the story. Instead of attempting another large battle, they decide to eliminate the source of Memnon's advantage. If the sorceress dies, they believe the king will lose his ability to predict future events, making him vulnerable to ordinary military tactics. This decision naturally leads to the introduction of the protagonist. Rather than revealing Mathayus through dramatic speeches or elaborate character introductions, the film allows other characters to build anticipation first. The tribal leaders decide that only an Akkadian assassin possesses enough skill to infiltrate Memnon's camp and complete such a dangerous mission. This is an effective storytelling technique because the audience hears about Mathayus before actually seeing him. Other characters describe the Akkadians as legendary warriors whose abilities are unmatched. By the time Mathayus finally appears on screen, viewers already expect someone extraordinary. However, the movie avoids presenting him as an untouchable superhero. His first scenes emphasize competence rather than invincibility. He is shown working alongside his brothers as professional assassins, carefully observing enemy positions before taking action. Their preparation highlights intelligence and patience instead of reckless bravery. This introduction immediately communicates several aspects of Mathayus' personality. He remains calm under pressure. He studies situations before acting. He trusts his companions. Most importantly, he approaches dangerous missions with professionalism rather than arrogance. The assassination mission itself becomes the first major action sequence of the film. Instead of delaying excitement, the movie quickly demonstrates the type of adventure audiences can expect. Stealth, archery, sword fighting, climbing, and survival all appear within the opening minutes. This early action serves an important purpose beyond entertainment. It establishes Mathayus as someone whose reputation is deserved. Audiences witness his exceptional skills firsthand instead of simply hearing other characters praise him. At the same time, the sequence carefully avoids making success look easy. Complications arise almost immediately. Enemy soldiers discover the assassins. Plans begin falling apart. The mission becomes far more dangerous than expected. This choice introduces vulnerability into the hero's character. Although Mathayus is clearly more capable than ordinary warriors, he cannot control every circumstance. One of the reasons The Scorpion King remains an engaging adventure film is that it builds its story around multiple layers of conflict instead of relying on a single battle between a hero and a villain. While the central premise appears straightforward on the surface, the narrative gradually reveals several interconnected struggles that affect both the protagonist and the world around him. These conflicts operate on different levels, including physical survival, political oppression, personal identity, emotional growth, leadership, destiny, and the responsibility that comes with power. Together, they create rising tension that carries the audience from the opening assassination mission all the way to the climactic final battle. The most obvious conflict is the external struggle between Mathayus and Memnon. From the beginning of the story, Memnon represents an unstoppable military force whose armies continue conquering neighboring tribes. Unlike many villains who rely solely on overwhelming numbers or superior weapons, Memnon possesses an advantage that appears almost impossible to overcome. His confidence comes from Cassandra, whose visions allow him to anticipate enemy strategies before battles even begin. This supernatural advantage changes the nature of the conflict. The tribes opposing Memnon are not simply facing a stronger army. They are confronting an enemy who seems to know the future. Every attempt to organize resistance has already failed because their plans are discovered before they can succeed. This immediately raises the stakes beyond those of a conventional war. If the audience believed the opposing tribes had an equal chance of victory, the story would lose much of its tension. Instead, the screenplay establishes that ordinary military tactics no longer work. Something completely different must happen if anyone hopes to stop Memnon's expansion. This leads directly to the first major objective of the film. Rather than attempting to defeat the king in open battle, the remaining tribal leaders hire Mathayus to assassinate Cassandra. They believe that by removing the source of Memnon's prophetic knowledge, his military superiority will disappear. At first glance, this seems like a simple assassination mission, but the screenplay quickly complicates the situation. Mathayus discovers that Cassandra is not the manipulative sorceress everyone expected. Instead, she is a young woman whose visions have placed her in a dangerous political position. She serves Memnon, but her relationship with him is far more complicated than the tribal leaders originally believed. This revelation shifts the central conflict. The mission is no longer about killing a mysterious enemy. It becomes a moral decision. Mathayus must determine whether following his original orders remains the right course of action. This moral conflict is important because it separates Mathayus from many traditional mercenary characters. In the beginning, he works primarily for money. He accepts dangerous contracts because that is how he survives. However, as the story progresses, his decisions become increasingly guided by personal ethics rather than financial reward. This transformation creates one of the film's strongest internal conflicts. Mathayus constantly struggles between the person he has always been and the leader he is gradually becoming. Early in the film, survival is his primary concern. He completes missions, avoids unnecessary risks, and thinks mainly about himself and his brothers. After their deaths, however, his perspective begins to change. Personal loss forces him to reconsider what truly matters. This emotional journey represents the internal heart of the movie. Although audiences primarily remember the exciting action scenes, the real story involves a man discovering that his abilities can serve a greater purpose than personal survival. Another layer of conflict emerges through the idea of leadership. Mathayus never seeks political power. He has no ambition to become a king or command armies. In fact, his profession as an assassin suggests someone accustomed to working alone rather than leading others. However, circumstances repeatedly push him into positions of responsibility. People begin looking to him for guidance. Companions trust his judgment. Rebels expect him to inspire hope. Each new responsibility increases the pressure placed upon him. This creates a conflict between independence and leadership. Remaining a solitary warrior would be easier. Accepting responsibility for others requires sacrifice. The film repeatedly asks whether Mathayus is willing to place the needs of an entire people above his own safety. This question becomes increasingly significant as the narrative develops. Another major conflict centers on fear versus courage. Memnon rules not only through military strength, but also through psychological intimidation. His reputation alone causes tribes to surrender before battles even begin. Stories of his victories spread throughout the region until many people believe resistance is impossible. This atmosphere of hopelessness becomes one of his greatest weapons. The film therefore presents courage as something contagious. Every successful act of resistance inspires others to believe victory might actually be possible. Mathayus does not simply defeat enemies through combat. He restores confidence. His victories weaken Memnon's psychological control over the population. This idea raises the narrative stakes beyond individual survival. If Mathayus fails, fear will continue spreading across the ancient world. If he succeeds, oppressed people regain hope. Another fascinating conflict exists between destiny and free will. Because Cassandra can foresee possible futures, many characters assume that events have already been decided. Memnon certainly believes this. He treats prophecy as proof that his victories are inevitable. Mathayus represents the opposite viewpoint. Throughout the story, he consistently acts as though determination and courage allow individuals to change their fate. This philosophical disagreement quietly influences many important scenes. Each time Mathayus survives impossible circumstances, audiences begin questioning whether destiny truly controls events or whether human choice ultimately matters more. One of the strengths of the Scorpion King is that its opposition is not limited to a single enemy standing in the hero's way. Although Memnon is clearly the primary antagonist, the film surrounds him with additional obstacles, dangerous environments, conflicting ideologies, and supernatural elements that constantly challenge the protagonist. Together, these antagonistic forces create a layered conflict that is much more interesting than a simple battle between good and evil. Each opposing force tests a different aspect of Mathayus' character, forcing him to prove not only his physical strength, but also his intelligence, leadership, morality, and determination. The central villain of the film is Memnon, a ruthless conqueror whose ambition extends far beyond ordinary military success. From the very beginning, the audience learns about him through stories rather than direct observation. Tribal leaders describe him as an unstoppable warlord whose armies continue expanding across the ancient world. Entire kingdoms have already fallen before his forces, while the few remaining free tribes know they cannot survive much longer if his campaign continues. This delayed introduction is an effective storytelling technique. By allowing other characters to describe Memnon before he appears, the film creates an aura of mystery and fear around him. Audiences develop expectations based on reputation alone. When he finally appears, viewers already understand that he represents the greatest threat in the story. Memnon's greatest strength is not simply that he commands a large army. Countless historical rulers possessed powerful militaries. What makes him unique is the combination of military power with supernatural knowledge. Through Cassandra's prophetic visions, Memnon believes he can anticipate enemy movements before battles even begin. This transforms him from a conventional conqueror into an almost mythical opponent. Because of this advantage, Memnon develops extraordinary confidence. He rarely questions whether he will win because he assumes the future has already been revealed to him. This certainty shapes nearly every aspect of his personality. He is calm under pressure, decisive in battle, and willing to take enormous risks because he believes destiny favors him. However, this confidence also becomes one of his greatest weaknesses. Throughout the film, Memnon gradually mistakes prophecy for invincibility. He begins believing that success belongs to him by right rather than by effort. This arrogance blinds him to changing circumstances. Instead of adapting when events unfold differently than expected, he continues trusting that his apparent destiny cannot be challenged. This character flaw is important because it prevents him from becoming a one-dimensional villain. Rather than losing because he is physically weaker than Mathayus, he loses because excessive confidence limits his ability to recognize genuine threats. In many ways, Memnon represents the dangers of absolute power. His victories have removed meaningful opposition. Few people dare question his decisions. Fear surrounds him constantly. Without criticism or accountability, he gradually comes to believe his own legend. The film therefore presents tyranny as something that corrupts both rulers and the societies they dominate. Another important aspect of Memnon's character is his understanding of fear as a political weapon. He does not rely solely upon violence. Instead, he encourages stories of his unstoppable victories to spread across neighboring kingdoms. Every successful conquest increases his psychological influence. tribes begin surrendering before battles even occur because they believe resistance is hopeless. This makes fear almost as valuable to him as military strength. The audience quickly realizes that defeating Memnon requires more than winning a single battle. His reputation itself has become part of his empire. Mathayus must therefore destroy not only the man, but also the illusion of invincibility surrounding him. This symbolic dimension gives the final confrontation greater importance. Another interesting feature of Memnon is that he genuinely possesses intelligence. He is not portrayed as reckless or foolish. He studies strategy. He understands politics. He knows how to inspire loyalty among soldiers. He recognizes valuable resources when he sees them. His success is therefore believable. Had he relied entirely upon brute force, audiences might question how he conquered so many kingdoms. Instead, the film presents him as someone capable of combining military discipline with careful planning. This makes him a credible threat throughout the narrative. However, Memnon also illustrates the corrupting influence of ambition. His desire for complete domination eventually outweighs every other concern. He views neighboring peoples not as human beings, but as obstacles preventing his expansion. Relationships become transactional. Loyalty becomes obedience. Compassion disappears almost entirely. This emotional emptiness contrasts sharply with Mathayus, whose journey gradually moves toward greater empathy and responsibility. The ideological conflict between the two men therefore becomes just as significant as their physical rivalry. Mathayus believes strength should protect others. Memnon believes strength grants permission to control others. Their final battle represents these opposing philosophies as much as personal revenge. Cassandra occupies a fascinating position within the story because she initially appears to function as part of the antagonistic force. The tribal leaders believe eliminating her will solve their problems. From their perspective, she is responsible for Memnon's victories. However, the audience gradually discovers that her role is far more complicated. She possesses genuine prophetic abilities, but she does not use them out of personal cruelty. Instead, she exists within circumstances largely beyond her control. This revelation transforms her from apparent antagonist into sympathetic ally. The screenplay cleverly challenges both Mathayus and the audience to reconsider initial assumptions. What first appears to be a straightforward assassination mission becomes an ethical dilemma. This twist enriches the story by demonstrating that appearances can be deceptive. The real source of oppression is not supernatural knowledge itself, but the way Memnon chooses to use it. Another antagonistic force comes from Memnon's army. The story of the Scorpion King follows one of the oldest and most recognizable storytelling patterns in history: the transformation of an ordinary individual into an extraordinary leader. Although Mathayus begins the film as a highly skilled warrior, he is not yet the legendary king whose name will eventually become part of myth. His journey is one of growth, responsibility, sacrifice, and self-discovery. By examining the film through the framework of Joseph Campbell's hero's journey, while also comparing it with the three-act structure and elements of the Save the Cat model, it becomes clear that the screenplay carefully follows many timeless narrative principles. These familiar storytelling techniques help explain why the film remains engaging despite its relatively straightforward premise. The hero's journey begins with what Campbell called the ordinary world. This stage introduces the protagonist before the central adventure changes his life forever. In the case of Mathayus, his ordinary world is far from peaceful, but it is normal from his perspective. He lives as an Akkadian assassin, traveling from mission to mission with his brothers. He works for payment rather than political ideals, relying on his combat skills to survive in a harsh and dangerous world. Although audiences immediately recognize that he is an exceptional fighter, his ambitions are surprisingly modest. He does not dream of becoming a king. He has no desire to lead armies or reshape history. Instead, his focus remains on completing assignments, protecting those closest to him, and staying alive. This establishes an important aspect of his character. Despite possessing extraordinary abilities, he initially thinks like an ordinary man. The next stage of the hero's journey is the call to adventure. This occurs when the remaining tribal leaders hire Mathayus to assassinate Cassandra, the sorceress whose visions make Memnon's conquest possible. On the surface, this appears to be another routine mission. However, the audience quickly understands that this assignment differs from every contract that came before it. The stakes extend far beyond financial reward. If Mathayus succeeds, countless tribes may regain hope. If he fails, an entire civilization could fall beneath Memnon's expanding empire. Although Mathayus accepts the mission primarily because it is his profession, destiny has already begun pulling him toward a much larger purpose. Interestingly, the film only briefly touches upon the traditional stage known as the refusal of the call. Many heroes initially hesitate before accepting responsibility. Mathayus does not openly reject the mission. However, his reluctance appears later in a different form. Throughout much of the story, he resists becoming a leader. He repeatedly attempts to focus on immediate survival rather than embracing the broader responsibilities others expect him to accept. This delayed reluctance functions similarly to Campbell's original concept. Rather than refusing the adventure itself, he resists the identity the adventure is creating. The next stage is meeting the mentor. The Scorpion King approaches this element differently than many heroic stories. Instead of one wise teacher guiding the protagonist throughout the journey, Mathayus learns from several different people. Cassandra becomes one source of guidance. Through her visions and understanding of destiny, she encourages him to think beyond his role as an assassin. Balthazar also serves as an unexpected mentor in certain situations. Although they initially distrust each other, their growing friendship allows both warriors to learn from one another. Even Arpid contributes lessons despite serving primarily as comic relief. His perspective reminds Mathayus that survival often requires cleverness rather than brute force. Rather than receiving wisdom from a single elderly master, Mathayus gradually develops through relationships with multiple companions. This modern variation reflects the collaborative nature of the story. Crossing the first threshold occurs when Mathayus infiltrates Memnon's territory and the mission begins collapsing around him. The deaths of his brothers permanently separate him from his previous life. There is no possibility of returning to the world exactly as it existed before. This moment represents the true beginning of the hero's transformation. Personal tragedy forces him into unfamiliar emotional territory. Revenge, grief, and responsibility replace professional detachment. From this point forward, every decision carries greater consequences. Campbell's next stage involves tests, allies, and enemies. This forms the largest portion of the movie. Mathayus encounters increasingly difficult challenges while gradually assembling companions who will help him. He forms an alliance with Balthazar despite their rivalry. He develops trust with Cassandra. Arpid repeatedly assists him despite his cowardly tendencies. At the same time, Memnon's soldiers, elite guards, and dangerous environments constantly test his abilities. These encounters serve several purposes. They strengthen relationships. They increase the audience's understanding of the world. They demonstrate the hero's growth. Most importantly, they prepare Mathayus for the final confrontation by forcing him to overcome progressively greater obstacles. One interesting aspect of these trials is that many require emotional intelligence rather than combat skill. Learning to trust others proves just as important as winning sword fights. Showing mercy becomes as significant as displaying strength. Accepting leadership requires greater courage than defeating individual enemies. This balance between physical and emotional challenges enriches the narrative. The approach to the innermost cave represents the stage where the hero prepares for the greatest challenge. In The Scorpion King, this occurs as Mathayus fully commits himself to confronting Memnon directly. The mission has evolved far beyond assassination. The conflict now concerns the future of entire kingdoms. Mathayus realizes that defeating Memnon requires more than personal bravery. He must inspire others to fight alongside him. This marks a major transformation. The solitary assassin has become a leader capable of uniting people. The ordeal follows. This is the story's emotional and physical climax. Mathayus faces overwhelming danger while confronting Memnon and everything the tyrant represents. The battle tests every lesson learned throughout the journey. When audiences think about the Scorpion King, they often remember the exciting sword fights, sweeping desert landscapes, and the rise of Dwayne Johnson as a leading action star. However, another important part of the film's identity lies in the technology and special effects that brought its ancient world to life. Released in 2002, the movie arrived during a fascinating period in Hollywood history. The film industry was rapidly embracing digital filmmaking, computer-generated imagery, and increasingly sophisticated visual effects. Yet many productions still relied heavily on practical filmmaking techniques. The Scorpion King occupies an interesting place between these two eras. Instead of depending almost entirely on computer graphics, it combines practical locations, real stunt work, physical sets, makeup effects, and carefully selected digital enhancements to support the storytelling. Understanding the visual effects of a Scorpion King also requires understanding the technological landscape of the early 2000s. Audiences had already seen groundbreaking digital achievements in films such as Jurassic Park, The Matrix, and The Lord of the Rings. Expectations for blockbuster spectacle were rising quickly. Studios were eager to demonstrate what modern visual effects could accomplish. But filmmakers were also discovering that relying too heavily on computer-generated imagery sometimes reduced realism. The Scorpion King approached this challenge differently from many fantasy films of its era. Rather than filling every scene with digital creatures and elaborate magical effects, the filmmakers chose to ground much of the adventure in real environments and physical performances. This decision gave the movie a tangible quality that still helps it hold up visually in many scenes. Perhaps the most important technical decision involved location photography. Instead of creating the entire ancient world inside sound stages surrounded by green screens, the production filmed many sequences in actual desert environments. Natural landscapes immediately provide details that are difficult to recreate digitally. Real sunlight behaves differently from artificial lighting. Actual sand moves unpredictably beneath actors' feet. Wind creates authentic movement in clothing and hair. Dust naturally fills the air during action sequences. All of these small details contribute to the audience's subconscious sense of realism. Because viewers instinctively recognize genuine outdoor environments, the world feels more believable even when mythical elements appear. This commitment to practical locations also benefited the performances. Actors interacted with authentic surroundings rather than imagining invisible landscapes that would later be added by computers. Climbing rocks, riding horses across deserts, and moving through real structures help create convincing physical performances. Another major strength of the film lies in its stunt work. Long before digital doubles became common, action scenes depended primarily on skilled stunt performers working alongside actors. The Scorpion King embraces this traditional approach. Many sword fights involve carefully choreographed practical combat. Performers swing real weapons, execute physical falls, and perform athletic movements in front of the camera rather than relying entirely on computer-generated animation. This gives the action a sense of weight. Every strike appears connected to genuine human movement. Every leap requires actual athletic ability. Every collision produces realistic physical reactions. Although modern audiences sometimes take this realism for granted, practical stunt work demands enormous preparation. Fight choreographers spend weeks designing combat sequences that appear dangerous while protecting performers. Actors must memorize movements with the precision of dancers. Camera operators position themselves carefully so choreography remains visible without exposing safety precautions. The result is action that feels energetic while remaining understandable. One of the most important technical achievements involves Dwayne Johnson's physical performance. Because the film represented one of his earliest starring roles, The production emphasized showcasing his natural athleticism rather than replacing him with digital effects. His background in professional wrestling proved extremely valuable. Years of performing physically demanding matches had given him exceptional body control, timing, and endurance. These abilities translated effectively into fantasy combat. Many scenes allow audiences to clearly see Johnson participating in the action. Rather than hiding the actor through rapid editing, the filmmakers frequently use wider shots that showcase his movements. This decision strengthens the illusion that Mathayus truly possesses extraordinary combat skills. Practical makeup effects also play an important role throughout the movie. Although the Scorpion King contains fewer supernatural creatures than the Mummy films, characters still experience injuries, wounds, dirt, and environmental wear. Makeup artists carefully applied these details to maintain continuity across lengthy action sequences. Small cuts, bruises, scratches, sunburn, dust, sweat, all help communicate the physical demands placed upon the characters. These subtle effects contribute significantly to realism, even though audiences may rarely notice them consciously. Costume design represents another area where practical craftsmanship outweighs digital technology. Every costume had a function both visually and physically. Armor needed to appear ancient while allowing performers freedom of movement. Robes had to respond naturally to desert winds. Weapons required convincing historical appearance while remaining safe during combat. The costume department worked closely with stunt coordinators to ensure clothing enhanced rather than restricted action scenes. The production design team faced similar challenges. Because the story unfolds within a mythical ancient civilization, environments needed to appear impressive without overwhelming the narrative. Physical sets were constructed for key locations, including palace interiors, temples, market areas, and military encampments. These tangible environments allowed actors to interact naturally with walls, staircases, furniture, and architectural details. Although The Scorpion King is often remembered for its action sequences, sword fights, and fantasy adventure, one of the reasons the film continues to entertain audiences is its emotional foundation. Beneath the battles, ancient kingdoms, and larger-than-life characters is a story about loss, responsibility, friendship, hope, sacrifice, and personal transformation. While it does not pursue the deep emotional complexity of a dramatic character study, the film succeeds because it gives audiences enough emotional investment to care about the people involved. Every major action sequence has emotional consequences, and every important relationship helps shape Mathayus into the legendary figure he eventually becomes. The emotional journey begins almost immediately with the introduction of Mathayus and his brothers. Although the audience spends only a limited amount of time with them before tragedy strikes, their relationship establishes something important about the protagonist. Despite being introduced as a highly skilled assassin, Mathayus is not portrayed as a cold or emotionless killer. He clearly values loyalty and family. His brothers are not simply fellow mercenaries working alongside him. They represent the people he trusts most in the world. This early bond creates the first emotional turning point of the movie. When the assassination mission fails and his brothers are killed, the audience witnesses the complete destruction of the life Mathayus previously understood. Their deaths immediately change the tone of the story. What began as another dangerous assignment becomes deeply personal. Revenge naturally enters the narrative, but the screenplay wisely avoids allowing revenge to become the hero's only motivation. Instead, grief becomes the emotional catalyst for growth. Loss forces Mathayus to question what kind of person he wants to become. This distinction makes his journey more meaningful. Many action heroes simply seek vengeance after tragedy. Mathayus gradually learns to pursue something greater. One reason this emotional shift works is because the film does not over-explain his feelings through lengthy speeches. Instead, audiences observe changes in his behavior. He becomes more determined, more protective, more willing to place himself in danger for others. His emotions emerge through actions rather than constant dialogue. This understated approach fits the character naturally. Another important source of emotional impact comes from the relationship between Mathayus and Cassandra. Their connection develops gradually throughout the story. When they first meet, suspicion dominates every interaction. Mathayus believes she is responsible for Memnon's military success. Cassandra views him as another dangerous warrior attempting to control her fate. Neither character immediately trusts the other. This slow progression makes their eventual relationship feel believable. Respect grows before affection. Understanding develops before romance. Each conversation reveals additional layers of personality. Mathayus discovers that Cassandra is not willingly supporting tyranny. Cassandra learns that Mathayus possesses compassion beneath his hardened exterior. Because the relationship develops through shared experiences rather than sudden attraction, audiences become emotionally invested in its outcome. The romance never overwhelms the adventure. Instead, it strengthens the protagonist's emotional growth. Perhaps the most important contribution Cassandra makes is helping Mathayus recognize that his destiny extends beyond personal survival. Through her influence, he begins viewing himself differently. She sees qualities within him that he has not yet fully accepted. This emotional encouragement becomes just as valuable as any weapon he carries. Friendship also plays a significant role in the film's emotional landscape. The relationship between Mathayus and Balthazar evolves from rivalry into mutual respect. Initially, both men compete with one another. Each possesses confidence. Each believes in his own abilities. Each approaches problems independently. Their personalities naturally create friction. However, shared struggles gradually replace competition with cooperation. This transformation reflects one of the movie's central emotional themes. True strength often comes from trusting others rather than standing alone. Their friendship develops through action rather than sentimental conversation. They fight together, survive together, protect one another. These shared experiences establish loyalty more effectively than lengthy emotional speeches ever could. Arpid provides another important emotional dimension. Although primarily serving as comic relief, he contributes something deeper beneath the humor. His fear makes him relatable. Unlike legendary warriors, Arpid reacts to danger much like ordinary people might. He hesitates. He worries. He looks for safer alternatives. Yet despite these fears, he repeatedly chooses to help his companions. This quiet courage demonstrates that bravery does not require the absence of fear. It requires acting despite fear. Many audiences connect with Arpid because he represents ordinary humanity within an extraordinary adventure. His presence also prevents the story from becoming emotionally overwhelming. Humor frequently appears after intense action sequences or moments of loss. These lighter interactions allow audiences emotional breathing room before the next challenge begins. Rather than weakening dramatic tension, the comedy actually strengthens it by creating greater emotional variety. Another significant emotional theme throughout the movie involves responsibility. At the beginning of the story, Mathayus accepts missions because they provide income. His concerns remain personal. He thinks primarily about himself and his immediate companions. As the narrative progresses, however, increasing numbers of people begin depending upon him. Tribes place their hopes in his success. Friends trust his judgment. Cassandra believes in his potential. This growing responsibility creates emotional pressure. Mathayus never asks to become a leader. He earns that role gradually. Watching him accept this responsibility provides one of the film's most satisfying emotional arcs. His greatest victory is not defeating Memnon. It is becoming someone worthy of leadership. Hope functions as another central emotional element. Throughout much of the story, hopelessness dominates the ancient world. Memnon's victories appear unstoppable. Tribes surrender before battles begin. Fear spreads faster than resistance. The Scorpion King occupies a somewhat unusual position when it comes to adaptation, because it is not based on a traditional source material like a novel, comic book, or historical biography. Instead, It emerges as a spin-off from the Mummy franchise, specifically building upon a character who originally appeared in The Mummy Returns. This means the film functions as both a prequel and an expansion of an already established fictional universe, while also standing on its own as a largely independent story. This dual purpose significantly influenced how the screenplay was written, how characters were developed, and how the mythology of the world was shaped. In The Mummy Returns, the Scorpion King is introduced as a legendary figure from ancient history, a warrior who made a dangerous pact with supernatural forces and was transformed into a monstrous being bound to serve Anubis. This version of the character appears near the end of the film in a visually spectacular sequence, but he is not given a detailed personal backstory. He functions more as a mythic threat than a fully developed character. Audiences learn that he was once human, that he once led armies, and that his downfall came through ambition and supernatural bargaining, but very little is revealed about his personality, motivations, or personal journey. The Scorpion King film takes this limited foundation and essentially rebuilds the character from the ground up. Instead of showing the fully corrupted, monstrous version of the figure, the prequel explores what that character might have been like before his transformation. This requires significant reinterpretation. The filmmakers must reconcile two different versions of the same identity: the legendary conqueror from myth and the human warrior experiencing personal growth and moral development. This creative gap becomes the central opportunity for adaptation. Because so little concrete information existed about Mathayus' early life, the writers had considerable freedom to invent new material while still maintaining loose continuity with the Mummy franchise. One of the most important adaptation decisions is the transformation of the Scorpion King from a near-mythological figure into a relatable human protagonist. In The Mummy Returns, he is portrayed almost entirely as an ancient, corrupted ruler whose humanity has already been lost. In the spin-off film, however, he is reimagined as a young, skilled assassin still capable of growth, emotional connection, and moral choice. This shift dramatically changes audience perception. Instead of viewing him as a distant legend, viewers are invited to experience his journey from ordinary beginnings to eventual greatness. The adaptation therefore functions as a character origin story rather than a strict continuation of established mythology. Another major adaptation choice involves tone. The Mummy Returns leans heavily into supernatural spectacle, combining horror elements with fantasy adventure. It features mummies, curses, undead armies, and apocalyptic stakes. In contrast, The Scorpion King reduces the emphasis on horror and leans more toward action-adventure and heroic fantasy. This tonal shift is significant because it allows the spin-off to appeal to a broader audience. Instead of focusing on fear and supernatural terror, the film emphasizes heroism, camaraderie, and adventure. While magic still exists within the world, it is not the dominant force shaping every aspect of the story. This change also helps distinguish the film from its predecessor. Rather than feeling like a repetition of the Mummy franchise formula, it establishes a separate identity within the same universe. The adaptation process also involves simplifying mythology. The Mummy films contain complex narratives involving ancient curses, reincarnation, divine artifacts, and elaborate supernatural systems. The Scorpion King streamlines this mythology considerably. Cassandra's visions remain the primary supernatural element, and prophecy becomes the key mystical force influencing events. Instead of introducing numerous magical systems, the film focuses on a single form of supernatural influence that directly affects the political and military conflict. This simplification serves two purposes. First, it makes the story more accessible to audiences who may not be familiar with the previous films. Second, it allows the narrative to remain centered on character development rather than world-building complexity. Another important adaptation decision involves the protagonist's personality. In The Mummy Returns, the Scorpion King is largely defined by his transformation into a monstrous being, suggesting corruption, ambition, and loss of humanity. The spin-off reinterprets him as fundamentally honorable even before his rise to leadership. Mathayus is not portrayed as evil or morally corrupt at the beginning of his journey. Instead, he is a professional mercenary operating within a harsh world where survival depends on skill and reputation. This reframing makes his eventual transformation into a leader feel earned rather than a return to lost goodness. The adaptation also expands supporting characters who were not present in the original mythology. Figures such as Cassandra, Balthazar, and Arpid are entirely new additions created for the spin-off narrative. These characters serve multiple purposes. They provide emotional grounding. They introduce ideological contrast. They allow exploration of trust, loyalty, and friendship. Without these additions, the story would focus almost entirely on Mathayus, which would limit opportunities for interpersonal development. Cassandra in particular represents a significant expansion of the mythology. While The Mummy Returns includes supernatural prophecy as a general concept, it does not explore a specific prophetic character with agency and emotional complexity. In The Scorpion King, Cassandra becomes a central figure whose visions actively shape political decisions and personal relationships. This adaptation choice deepens the role of prophecy within the universe. It is no longer just a background mystical force. Instead, it becomes a lived experience affecting an individual who struggles with power, control, and identity. Balthazar and Arpid also serve important adaptation functions by representing different responses to authority and survival. Balthazar reflects warrior honor shaped by experience and conflict, while Arpid represents opportunistic survival instincts. Together, they broaden the moral and emotional landscape of the story. The Scorpion King may appear at first glance to be a straightforward action-adventure set in an ancient fantasy world, but like many films connected to larger franchises and built during the early 2000s Hollywood production era, it contains subtle details, visual callbacks, narrative foreshadowing, and small creative choices that reward attentive viewers. These elements are not always presented as traditional Easter eggs in the modern sense, but they function in similar ways by adding depth, continuity, and texture to the film's world. One of the most interesting layers of hidden detail comes from the film's connection to the broader Mummy universe. Although The Scorpion King functions primarily as a standalone origin story, it quietly reinforces mythological continuity through names, symbols, and thematic echoes rather than explicit references. Viewers familiar with The Mummy Returns will recognize that Mathayus is already part of a larger mythic timeline, even if the spin-off does not directly reference later events in detail. This subtle continuity is achieved not through exposition, but through tonal consistency. The desert landscapes, ancient ruins, and mystical elements feel like they belong to the same mythological ecosystem. The world itself becomes a hidden link between films, suggesting that these stories are different interpretations of the same ancient history. Another subtle detail lies in the way prophecy is visually represented. Cassandra's visions are not simply narrative devices, but are often accompanied by specific visual cues, such as lighting shifts, sudden atmospheric changes, or altered focus. These moments are designed to signal to the audience that reality is being filtered through perception rather than presented objectively. Careful viewers may notice that these vision sequences often echo later events in slightly fragmented or symbolic form. This creates a layered foreshadowing system where the audience is exposed to potential outcomes without fully understanding them at the time. When these events later unfold, the earlier imagery gains new meaning in hindsight. Mathayus himself is also surrounded by subtle foreshadowing that hints at his eventual transformation into a legendary figure. Early in the film, he is repeatedly described in terms that emphasize both isolation and potential. Characters refer to him as a dangerous warrior, but also as someone whose future is not yet defined. This dual framing subtly suggests that his identity is in transition. Even his reluctance to accept leadership can be read as foreshadowing of his eventual rise to power. The film quietly reinforces the idea that greatness is not immediate, but developed through experience, sacrifice, and repeated moral choices. The symbolism of animals also plays a quiet but meaningful role in the film's visual language. While the title Scorpion King is not directly explained within the narrative in a literal sense, the scorpion becomes a symbolic representation of survival, endurance, and lethal precision. Scorpions are creatures associated with harsh environments, hidden danger, and resilience in extreme conditions. These traits mirror Mathayus' own journey as he navigates the desert world and survives increasingly difficult challenges. Although the film does not constantly draw attention to this symbolism, it appears in small visual touches and thematic parallels. The desert itself becomes a kind of living extension of the scorpion metaphor, where survival depends on adaptability and instinct. Another hidden detail can be found in the costuming and armor design. Mathayus' evolving appearance subtly reflects his internal transformation. Early in the film, his clothing is more utilitarian and associated with mercenary work. As the story progresses and he becomes more involved in leadership and rebellion, his visual presentation gradually shifts toward more iconic and symbolic warrior aesthetics. This progression is not abrupt but incremental, reinforcing the idea that identity in the film is something that develops over time rather than changing suddenly. Attentive viewers may notice that by the later stages of the film, his appearance aligns more closely with the legendary image audiences associate with the Scorpion King in myth. The film also contains small environmental storytelling details that reward close observation. For example, settlements and camps often reflect the influence of Memnon's expanding empire. Architecture becomes more uniform and militarized in regions under his control, while free or resisting areas maintain more diverse and improvised structures. This contrast visually communicates political dominance without requiring explicit explanation. Memnon's presence is also reinforced through symbolic staging. He is frequently positioned in elevated or centralized compositions within his environments, visually reinforcing his role as a dominating political force. Even when he is not physically present, his influence is suggested through banners, guards, and architectural design that emphasizes control and order. Another layer of subtle detail appears in the way the film handles weapons and combat styles. Different factions and characters use distinct fighting techniques that reflect cultural and ideological differences. Memnon's forces often fight in coordinated, disciplined formations, while Mathayus and his allies rely more on improvisation, agility, and individual skill. This contrast is not only narrative but also visual, helping viewers subconsciously understand differences in philosophy. There are also small continuity-based details that contribute to immersion. Wounds sustained in earlier battles often remain visible in later scenes, reinforcing the physical cost of the journey. Dust, sweat, and environmental wear accumulate gradually, preventing characters from appearing artificially clean during extended travel sequences. These details may not be consciously noticed by most viewers, but they significantly enhance realism. Arpid's presence also contains subtle narrative layering beyond comic relief. While his behavior often appears opportunistic or self-interested, small moments throughout the film reveal that his actions consistently align, even unintentionally, with survival intelligence. His instinct to avoid danger often anticipates real threats, suggesting that his caution, while comedic, is also grounded in practical awareness. The Scorpion King represents an important case study in early 2000s Hollywood franchise economics, particularly in how studios experimented with spin-offs, prequels, and character-driven expansions of already successful intellectual properties. Produced and distributed by Universal Pictures, the film was developed during a period when studios were increasingly focused on building interconnected cinematic universes and leveraging recognizable elements from established franchises to reduce financial risk while expanding long-term profitability. At its core, the film's financial strategy was relatively straightforward. Rather than launching an entirely original property with unknown audience appeal, the studio built the Scorpion King around a character introduced in the commercially successful Mummy franchise. This connection provided an immediate marketing advantage. Audiences already familiar with The Mummy Returns were more likely to recognize the character of Mathayus and show curiosity about his origin story. This familiarity reduced the uncertainty that often accompanies original fantasy adventure films. Universal Pictures had already experienced strong commercial success with the Mummy films, which combined action, adventure, and supernatural elements in a way that appealed to global audiences. This success encouraged the studio to explore additional stories within the same mythological universe. The Scorpion King became one of the earliest examples of a spin-off film designed not merely as a sequel, but as a standalone expansion of a supporting character's backstory. From a production budgeting perspective, the film was positioned in the mid-range blockbuster category for its time. It was not as expensive as the largest effects-driven fantasy epics of the early 2000s, but it still required a substantial investment due to its action sequences, desert location shooting, stunt coordination, and visual effects work. The budget reflected a balance between practical filmmaking and digital enhancement, with significant resources allocated to location production in desert environments, set construction for ancient cities and palaces, costume and prop design, and post-production effects integration. One of the key financial advantages of the film's production approach was its reliance on real-world locations. Shooting in natural desert environments reduced the need for extensive full-scale digital world building, which at the time would have significantly increased costs. While visual effects were still essential, particularly for large-scale battle enhancements and environmental extensions, the use of physical landscapes helped control expenses while also improving visual authenticity. Casting decisions also played an important role in the film's financial positioning. The Scorpion King marked one of the first major starring roles for Dwayne Johnson in a leading cinematic capacity. At the time, he was widely known for his career in professional wrestling and for his brief appearance in The Mummy Returns, but he had not yet become the globally dominant film star he would later evolve into. From a studio perspective, casting Johnson represented both a risk and an opportunity. The risk stemmed from his limited track record as a lead actor in major motion pictures. However, his popularity, physical presence, and growing fan base provided significant marketing appeal. His transition from wrestling entertainment to action cinema also generated media interest, which helped increase awareness of the project prior to release. This casting decision ultimately proved financially beneficial, as Johnson's performance and screen presence became a major selling point for audiences. The film effectively launched his career as a bankable action star, which later contributed to substantial long-term franchise value from multiple studios across the industry. Marketing for The Scorpion King followed traditional blockbuster strategies of the early 2000s, relying heavily on theatrical trailers, television advertising, promotional partnerships, and association with the Mummy franchise. The marketing campaign emphasized large-scale action, desert warfare, heroic imagery, and the rise of a new action hero. This positioning was designed to appeal to audiences who enjoyed fantasy adventure films, historical epics, and action-driven storytelling. The connection to the Mummy franchise was central to the promotional strategy, but the marketing also needed to establish the film as accessible to viewers who had not seen previous entries. As a result, promotional materials carefully balanced continuity with independence, ensuring that the film appeared both familiar and self-contained. Upon release, The Scorpion King performed strongly at the global box office relative to its production budget. It opened with significant commercial momentum, benefiting from strong brand recognition, effective marketing, and audience interest in the expansion of the Mummy universe. Its domestic performance in North America was particularly strong during its opening period, reflecting high anticipation and effective promotional rollout. International markets also contributed substantially to the film's overall financial success. The combination of action-oriented storytelling, minimal reliance on dialogue-heavy exposition, and universal themes of heroism and rebellion made the film accessible to a wide global audience. Desert-based adventure narratives historically perform well in international markets due to their visual clarity and emphasis on physical action rather than culturally specific dialogue. While exact figures vary depending on reporting methodology and territory accounting, the film ultimately generated revenues significantly exceeding its production budget, securing its status as a commercial success. This profitability reinforced Universal Pictures' strategy of developing spin-offs and expanding established intellectual properties. However, the film's financial performance also reflects certain limitations common to franchise spin-offs. While it was successful, it did not reach the same level of cultural or long-term box office dominance as the main Mummy films. This is partly due to the absence of the established ensemble cast, and partly due to the challenge of building a new protagonist from a supporting character origin. The Scorpion King occupies an interesting place in fandom culture because it sits at the intersection of a major fantasy franchise, an early 2000s action film, and the early rise of modern internet-based fan communities. While it never developed the massive, deeply organized fandom structures seen in later blockbuster universes, it still generated a consistent and enduring audience presence that continues to exist across online platforms, discussion forums, and nostalgia-driven media spaces. At the time of its release, fan engagement looked very different from what it does today. Social media platforms were either in their infancy or did not yet exist in their modern form. Fan discussion primarily took place on message boards, early movie review sites, DVD bonus feature communities, and general entertainment forums. Audiences who enjoyed fantasy adventure films often grouped The Scorpion King alongside similar early 2000s productions, discussing it in relation to the Mummy films, Sword and Sandal epics, and other action-heavy historical fantasies. One of the most consistent elements of fan discussion revolves around Dwayne Johnson's performance. Even in early audience reactions, viewers frequently noted his physical presence, charisma, and ability to carry action sequences. Over time, as Johnson became one of the most recognizable global film stars, The Scorpion King gained renewed attention as the project that marked his transition from wrestling fame to mainstream Hollywood leading man status. This retrospective appreciation has become a major part of the film's fandom identity. Many modern fans revisit the movie not only for its story, but also to observe the early stages of a major action star's development. This has contributed to a kind of origin nostalgia, where the film is appreciated as a foundational moment in his career rather than solely on its standalone merits. Another important aspect of fandom surrounding The Scorpion King is its connection to the Mummy franchise community. Fans of the Mummy films often discuss The Scorpion King as part of a broader mythological timeline. This connection encourages comparative analysis between the tone, storytelling style, and mythological interpretation of both properties. Discussions frequently explore how the character of Mathayus differs in his standalone portrayal compared to his more mythic and supernatural depiction in The Mummy Returns. This comparative fandom dynamic creates ongoing debate about continuity, characterization, and myth interpretation. Some fans prefer the grounded, humanized version of Mathayus in the spin-off, while others are more attached to the larger-than-life mythical version seen in the original franchise appearance. This split perspective contributes to the film's long-term discussion presence within fan communities. Online fandom spaces also frequently focus on the film's action sequences and set pieces. Fight choreography, desert battles, and large-scale confrontations are often revisited in clip compilations, retrospective rankings, and nostalgic discussion threads. These scenes are appreciated for their practical stunt work and relatively grounded visual effects compared to more digitally saturated modern action films. Another recurring topic in fan discussions involves the film's tone and early 2000s aesthetic. Many viewers associate The Scorpion King with a specific cinematic era characterized by practical sets, desert adventure storytelling, and a transitional stage between traditional filmmaking and modern digital effects-heavy productions. This has led to the film being included in broader nostalgia conversations about early blockbuster cinema. Fan art and creative reinterpretations of the Scorpion King universe have also appeared over time, though not at the scale of larger fantasy franchises. These works often emphasize Mathayus as a heroic warrior figure, sometimes blending his appearance from the film with more mythological or stylized interpretations. The character's iconic visual design lends itself well to stylized depictions, particularly in digital art communities. Arpid, Balthazar, and Cassandra also occasionally appear in fan-created content, usually highlighted for their distinct personality roles within the story. Cassandra in particular is often reinterpreted in fan discussions as a more central mystical figure, with expanded exploration of her prophetic abilities beyond what is shown in the film. Fan theories surrounding the Scorpion King tend to focus less on complex narrative mysteries and more on world-building speculation. Viewers often discuss how the film's ancient world connects to the broader Mummy universe, how prophecy functions within its mythology, and what the long-term fate of its characters might be after the film's conclusion. Because the film leaves certain narrative elements open-ended, it naturally encourages imaginative expansion. One interesting aspect of fandom engagement is the way the film has been re-evaluated over time through internet culture. Early reviews were mixed, and audience reactions were generally positive but not overwhelmingly enthusiastic. However, as internet nostalgia culture grew, the film began to be revisited in a more affectionate context. This shift reflects a broader trend in which early 2000s fantasy and action films are reassessed through a nostalgic lens that emphasizes entertainment value and stylistic charm rather than critical perfection. Memes and humorous reinterpretations have also contributed to the film's modern fandom presence. Certain scenes, expressions, and action moments have been shared and repurposed in online meme culture, often highlighting exaggerated action tropes or early digital effects aesthetics. This form of engagement helps keep the film present in digital cultural memory, even among audiences who did not experience it at release. The Scorpion King also maintains a presence in fan discussions about franchise expansion and cinematic universes. Because it is one of the earlier examples of a spin-off origin story, it is often referenced in conversations about how studios attempt to build new franchises from supporting characters. Fans and commentators sometimes use it as a case study when discussing successful and less successful approaches to universe building in Hollywood. Over 2 decades after its release, The Scorpion King has undergone a noticeable shift in how it is perceived by audiences, critics, and online film communities. What was once viewed primarily as a mid-tier early 2000s action fantasy spin-off is now often reassessed through the lens of nostalgia, franchise history, and the evolving legacy of Dwayne Johnson as a global film star. This change in perception reflects broader trends in how older blockbuster films are re-evaluated in the streaming era, where accessibility and repeated viewing opportunities reshape cultural memory. At the time of its release, the film received mixed critical reviews. Many reviewers acknowledged its entertaining action sequences and strong central performance, while also pointing out limitations in narrative depth, character complexity, and visual effects consistency by the standards of the period. Audiences were generally more receptive than critics, especially viewers who enjoyed the Mummy franchise or fantasy adventure films in general. The film was seen as enjoyable but not groundbreaking, a solid entertainment product rather than a defining cinematic achievement. However, modern reassessment tends to be more nuanced and often more forgiving. One of the most significant factors influencing this shift is the long-term career trajectory of Dwayne Johnson. As he became one of the most recognizable and commercially successful action stars in global cinema, audiences began revisiting his earlier films with renewed interest. The Scorpion King, as his first major starring role, gained retrospective importance as the starting point of a major Hollywood career. This career contextual viewing changes how the film is interpreted. Rather than being judged solely on its standalone merits, it is often evaluated as a foundational moment in the development of a modern action star persona. Viewers now pay attention to his physical performance, screen presence, and charisma in ways that align with his later work, recognizing early expressions of traits that would define his career. Another major factor in modern reassessment is nostalgia for early 2000 cinema. The Scorpion King is frequently grouped with other fantasy and action-adventure films of its era, a period characterized by practical stunt work, location shooting, and transitional visual effects technology. Contemporary audiences often view this period with affection, appreciating its tactile sense of production and its relatively grounded approach compared to heavily digital modern blockbusters. This nostalgia is not simply aesthetic, but also structural. Many viewers appreciate the film's clear narrative progression, relatively linear storytelling, and emphasis on physical action over complex cinematic universes or multi-film continuity systems. In an era dominated by interconnected franchises, the self-contained nature of The Scorpion King is sometimes seen as refreshing. Modern audiences also tend to reassess the film's visual effects more charitably in context. While some digital elements appear dated by current standards, there is increasing recognition of the technical limitations of early 2000 CGI. Viewers often note that the combination of practical environments and digital augmentation gives the film a more tangible feel than many contemporaneous effects-heavy productions. This hybrid approach is sometimes appreciated as a transitional style that bridges traditional filmmaking and modern digital cinema. The film's action choreography is another area that receives improved retrospective evaluation. Contemporary viewers often highlight the clarity of fight sequences, the use of wide shots to showcase physical performance, and the emphasis on stunt work over rapid editing. In comparison to more modern action films that sometimes rely on fast cutting and heavily stylized camera movement, The Scorpion King is seen by some audiences as more visually readable and grounded in physical space. At the same time, modern reassessment does not ignore the film's limitations. Critics and viewers still point out that the narrative is relatively simple. Supporting characters are not deeply developed compared to modern ensemble-driven storytelling, and some dialogue reflects early 2000s genre conventions that feel dated today. However, these criticisms are often balanced against the film's entertainment value and historical context, rather than being treated as definitive flaws. Another important aspect of modern perspective involves the evolution of franchise storytelling. The Scorpion King is frequently discussed in retrospectives about early attempts to expand cinematic universes. While modern franchises often involve highly interconnected narratives across multiple films and platforms, this film represents a more isolated form of spin-off storytelling. It demonstrates both the potential and the limitations of building a standalone origin story from a supporting character in an established franchise. In hindsight, the film is sometimes viewed as an early experiment in the kind of universe expansion that would later become standard in Hollywood. However, it also highlights how difficult it can be to sustain long-term narrative momentum when branching away from a core ensemble cast. This makes it an interesting reference point in discussions about franchise evolution. The cultural memory of the film has also been influenced by internet-era discourse. Online communities often revisit The Scorpion King in the context of "so bad it's good," early CGI era, or nostalgic action cinema discussions. While the film is not typically classified as unintentionally humorous in a purely ironic sense, certain visual effects moments and stylistic choices have become widely circulated in meme culture. This form of engagement keeps the film visible to younger audiences who may not otherwise encounter it. Streaming platforms have also played a significant role in its modern reassessment. Increased availability allows new viewers to discover the film outside of theatrical or DVD contexts. This accessibility encourages reevaluation, as audiences can compare it directly with both its contemporaries and modern equivalents. Streaming also supports repeat viewing, which often leads to greater appreciation of pacing, character dynamics, and action structure.